fantasy short stories. Of Portals and Portents by Lesley Herron. Chapter 33, Gold. There are those that think pain only lives in the body, but that kind of pain is merely the firing of synapses, warnings of injury. No, true agony exists only in memory, of loss, regret, and the decaying hopes of moments that might have been. These are things that are locked behind iron doors in the mind, and rightfully so. But inevitably, the key is found and the door thrust open, releasing that pain once more. If Vel had not been clutching at the table for support, he would have dropped to his knees. Tears began to form in his eyes, whether from anger or anguish. It didn't matter. Eric had twisted that one word into his heart like a knife. He had spent nearly 15 years of his existence trying to forget that silly, stupid name. 5,175 days, to be exact. And on each one, he had been unsuccessful. How dare you? His voice came out in a dangerous, low hiss as his fingers clenched tighter at the lip of the wooden surface. Eric's face twisted in confusion. Wait, I don't understand. He lowered his hands. This is what you wanted, right? His attention shifted back to the keyboard of his computer. That alluring song, the beautiful simplicity of the solution was tempting him inch by inch back to his task, despite the look of murderous rage on his brother's face. To get back to Lucas? Vel wrenched back on his hold and flipped the table, sending it flying towards the far wall. Hearing it again was too much, his fury bubbling over. There was a deafening explosion, the fizzle of snapped wires and shattering of glass mirrors and porcelain mugs. The cord connecting the computer to the spinning rings above his head pulled taut, and the Ophanum was ripped free from the rafters. It clattered to the ground with a hollow boom. He didn't give Eric even a breath before Vel reached across the chaos and snapped his brother up by the lapel of his blue Hawaiian shirt. How dare you! He hauled him off his feet and spun, lunging to slam the man into the stone wall. What did I do? Gripping Eric tight with his mechanical hand, Vel allowed his emotions to fuel the strikes from his left. You don't get to say that name! Each time his bare knuckles made contact, a faded memory surfaced in Vel's mind. That stupid, silly face smiling at those bright blue lanterns in their greenhouse. I don't get to say that name! Those long nights he spent learning sign language in secret as a surprise. Blood began to leak from the lacerations in his knuckles, but he ignored them, and the protests from Eric as he continued to pummel the man. As the last memory rose, his grip faltered, and his raised fist hung loose in the air. The ghost that haunted him still. The last time he saw that silly, stupid face. It was the one picture in his mind that he had tried so hard to drown in alcohol, but never could. They had fought over something stupid, Vel was sure, but that look of anger and those empty, callous words were burned into his core. His words, and it brought tears of regret to his eyes. I don't understand, Eric rasped through bloody teeth. His right eye was swelling, his glasses knocked away and broken on the floor. That's what I'm trying to fix, to get you home. Don't you want to go back to... No! Vel shook his brother, pressing him harder against the wall and preventing him from carelessly uttering that name again. His jaw was clenched tight, but there was a waver in his hard scowl.
Of course I want to go home. It's the only thing I've wanted since I followed you through that stupid rift.
That fleeting moment passed, and his face hardened once more.
But my happiness is not worth deleting this reality. I finally made something with this broken life you gave me, and I will not let you take it away to assuage your guilt.
Eric struggled to fend off his brother, scowling at the stupidity of the answer.
Holy's with the emotions,
he wheezed, fighting to pull in a gasp of breath from the pressure on his chest.
That's right.
Vel relaxed his grip on the man enough to let him breathe.
You've never loved a damn thing in your life, so I wouldn't expect you to understand how I feel. How you feel?
Eric choked on the sour, coppery tang that coated his tongue. His right eye was completely swollen shut now, tears leaking from the corner.
You're preventing me from saving billions of lives because you made some friends?
His good eye swiveled over to the computer, lying on its side next to the Ophanum. He didn't have time for this. He struggled to free one of his hands and pulled back, letting it fly towards his brother.
Grow up!
Vel let it land, showing no sign that it had fazed him in the slightest. Of all the things Eric had done to him, this didn't even register. He leveled a threatening finger on him, blood still seeping from the broken skin of his knuckles.
Don't make me use my right hand.
As if in response to his threat, a spike of pain lanced through Vel's mind, and he dropped his brother, backing away quickly. He should have known this could happen. Eric had acquired some dark magic after all, but in the heat of the moment, he had forgotten. He continued to put distance between them, and he looked up to see confusion written on his brother's face. This wasn't Eric's doing. Vel's vision began to shimmer, the pain intensifying. That meant,
Amy, I need you to... Ah!
His knees buckled beneath him, cutting the words from his mouth as the door to the room crashed inward, flying off its hinges and smashing into the far wall.
Elias?
Eric watched in stunned horror as the king strode into the room, surrounded by a purple aura and his face unrecognizable through the tangle of hair caught in 2 sets of antlers sprouting from his head. Rivaria swung her gaze across the mess, over the scattered piles of machinery to the man twitching on the floor, clutching at his head, then landing on Eric.
Stop gawking. Where are we with the portal?
Shaking clear his mind, Eric dropped to the floor by his computer, sifting through the chaos. Whatever was wrong with Elias, it didn't matter. The only important thing right now was getting back, even if Vel was too stubborn to realize it was what they both needed. He gently shifted the boxy monitor until it was sitting upright, and he wiped the dust from the screen. His code was still there, beaming up at him in green text. Eric let out a long exhale, releasing some of the tension from his being.
Nearly there. I just need to get everything reconnected again and... No.
Vel forced himself to his hands and knees, fighting through the pain. Tears streamed down his face from the effort of moving his lead body and the agony in his mind. Eric frowned as he spat out a glob of blood. He flickered his attention up to the king.
I'll get this working. Go take care of him.
Rivaria bristled, her eyes flashing dangerously as she bored into the little scientist.
I am not your servant. If you want me to fix things, then yes you are.
She flexed her might, only for a second, and a pulse of energy rippled through the room, cracking every remaining undamaged mirror. When the puny creature before her failed to flinch, Rivaria clicked her tongue against her teeth.
Very well. Do you have any objections to his death?
She swiveled on her heel.
I have a sudden urge to rip out a spine.
Eric pulled over the keyboard.
Whatever. Just keep him away from me.
She paused, having expected him to protest.
You don't care what happens to your brother. What about this don't you people understand?
Eric tossed his hands in the air.
Anything we do now will have never happened. All of it erased. Every mistake undone.
Rivaria felt an odd flicker of hope at those words. She could play along, pretend to bend the knee for the chance to go back. Every mistake. With a dark grin on her face, she turned to see the cyborg was still on his knees, one hand moving weakly through the air as if to catch a bug. Her long legs carried her over to him in just a few strides. She reached down and plucked him up by his shirt.
I would say nothing personal, but I have the king's memories. If he were still alive, he would take great pleasure in this.
As Rivaria hauled him upright, the man's metal fist shot upward and slammed into the underside of her jaw, sending her staggering back and blurring her vision with a burst of stars. Vel stared at his interface, now blazing red with outlines that flickered over everything. Amy was showing him attack trajectories, defense suggestions, and the words combat mode glowing in the upper right corner. The constant stream of error messages had been relegated to the bottom of his display. With a final tap of the empty space, his interface glitched, but the status bar of his pain receptors had drained to 0, and the agony in his mind faded to a mild itch. It sent a cold chill through his soul. Without that pain, he felt more machine and less human. A monster. He glanced at his brother. Maybe it ran in the family. Despite that trickle of fear, a calm settled into Vel. Even as a flash of red registered an incoming attack, he simply leaned right, letting the clawed fists miss his face by a hair, and he retaliated, sinking his metal knuckles into Elias's chest, followed by a knee to the gut that sent the man staggering back, but not as far as he had expected. Eric pulled his attention away from the two and leaned over, connecting the keyboard back to his computer. He furiously typed out the last few lines to close up the code segment before smashing his finger on the Enter key. The program began to compile, but before Eric could even breathe out a sigh of relief, an error message flashed on the screen. Targeting component not found. His eyes snapped over to the Ophanum, now lying on the floor next to the damaged but still intact housing of his CPU. Scrambling over to it, a quick inspection told him the issue. One of the inner rings had snapped loose and stopped spinning. He scratched at his head. He wasn't sure he could fix it, but he had to try. The room shook as Vel's back slammed into the stone wall hard enough to send fissures webbing out in all directions. The king let out a cry of anger and aimed a fist at his face with all the fury and power of a freight train. He barely managed to dodge out of the way, one of his metal vertebrae locking as he twisted. The wall shattered beneath her fist, exploding outward into the night sky. She had forgotten how beautiful her world could be. It had been so long. Rivaria stared in awe at the starlit horizon, before her gaze drifted down to the glowing golden city below, visible from the dizzying height. But that serene moment shattered as she felt the cyborg's fist connect with the metal rebar still embedded in the back of her neck from when the Selkie had tried to drown her. The metal shaft forced its way out the front of her throat, and she spat out a burst of blood, spinning as lights popped in her vision. She felt her wooden hand smack into the side of his head, and her elongated fingers wrapped around his skull, ensnaring the cyborg like a hare in a trap. Her eyes flashed purple, and she lifted him off his feet.
"Enough, you insignificant gnat!"
Despite the artificial components and metal plates, she could feel the edges of the man's shade. It was tattered and torn from losing so much of himself.
"Perhaps you'll do better to join the ranks of my undead."
Rivaria began to pull, draining his life force as she ripped free the piece of metal from her neck. But the flow halted before it reached her fingertips. It resisted her, regardless of how hard she tugged against it. Shades were her domain. They were supposed to obey her every whim. She continued to pull, but the force of the resistance was pushing her back, like two opposing magnets. The cyborg struggled against her grip, his mechanical fingers digging in to tear off a chunk of her wooden arm, but Rivaria persisted. Deeper into his soul she delved, until that magnetic repulsion flipped. Her eyes widened as her own essence began to flow toward him. Screaming in pain, she withdrew her hand and backpedaled.
"What are you?"
Vel didn't respond with words, but instead charged, slamming into the king, and the two of them toppled over the upturned table. Eric was nearly crushed by the weight of the squabbling pair, but before he could even form a curse in his mouth, they were back on their feet and fighting once more. After checking on the cables, he sent up a silent prayer that his fix on the Ophanum would hold, and slammed his finger down on the enter key once more. Strings of text whizzed by as the program began to compile, and he could hear the inner workings of the robot hum to life as its dead eyes flickered. There was a thunderous, reverberating squeal that erupted throughout the room, like two massive tectonic plates grinding against one another. He spun to see a seam of blazing red tear into their reality in a line, crackling with tiny flashes of light as antimatter and matter began to interact around the edges. It was forming his Alcubierre bubble. Elation and a hint of disbelief pulled Eric's face into a shaky smile. Rivaria turned at the sudden crimson light to see a forming gateway splitting the middle of the room. The possibilities, the things she could change. This world would have its gods once again. Something flew past her, hurtling towards the scientist. She shot out a hand, barely managing to grab hold of the cyborg before he reached his brother.
"You fool!"
As he was hauled back, Vel spun. Anger, rage, and desperation sparked down every nerve, and he was spitting inarticulately as he could see his reality begin to draw close to an end. He reached out with a bestial cry and grabbed hold of one of the king's horns and wrenched their face down, slamming it into his knee. Blood erupted from her nose, and she tried to retreat, but the grip was iron, and Rivaria couldn't break free. His hold only intensified as she struggled. He seized a second horn and twisted against her with enough torque that she felt her spine snap. Even as her limbs dropped like dead weight, her magic flowed towards the fracture, knitting the severed tissues. But she couldn't force her limp body upright fast enough to block the heel of his boot. She was sent backwards towards the open wall, regaining control of her borrowed body just in time to reach out and clutch one of the sides. The cyborg's mechanical hand snapped around her neck, squeezing with enough force to crush stone. Rivaria struggled to breathe, but at the moment of contact, the energy siphon began again, sapping her of her strength. And with each passing second, her grip on the wall weakened as he pushed her further and further out over the open expanse. Wide-eyed with fury, She could only shout,
"I am a god!"
Vel's vision burned with flickering red flames across his interface.
"And I don't care."
With a final shove, he felt the king's fingers break free. That was the last thing his mind registered before the world broke, reality crumbling around him like the walls of a dream, leaving only black.
Critical failure.
And then, even that disappeared. Rivaria's foot slipped, and she began to plummet. She managed to snag onto the bottom edge of the hole with her wooden hand. Thousands of feet below her, the ground rumbled at the lost chance to take her life. Perhaps the little queen was right. Could this body die? Deciding against finding out, she clawed her way back into the tower. She pulled herself to her feet and was standing beside the crumpled, unmoving form of the cyborg. She walked around his body before casually placing a boot on his fallen form. The ground below could yet have a meal. But the grinding thrum of the portal halted Rivaria as it grew in pitch, screaming into a register that ripped at her ears with its wailing cry. Eric watched as the red fissure began to shrink, the line pulling back in on itself.
"No, no, no!"
His fingers shot back to the keyboard, ready to fix his code, but the screen did not show scrolling text anymore, only the words, "You chose wrong," in large, bold letters.
"Wilfred."
He growled the word like a curse. The wail from the portal reached a peak, and Eric glanced back up to see the line become a single point, then ruptured outward into an explosion of blue electricity. The force rocked the room, toppling the chalkboards and shattering the cracked mirrors. The pulse moved outwards through the stone walls without a care, expanding at an exponential pace. Rivaria straightened up, pulling her hands down from her bleeding ears as she watched the blue orb disappear into the far horizon and up past the stratosphere.
"What was that?" "I don't know."
Eric pulled at the ends of his bangs for a moment before he began typing at the keyboard again.
The old man added some sort of failsafe, a kind of virus that kicked in and overrode my program.
Try as he might, he couldn't get the smug message off the screen.
Where that elderly arcanist even learned to program is beyond me. Give me a minute.
There was a groan near the open wall, and they both looked over to see Vel climbing to his feet. Growling in frustration, Rivaria moved forward to shove the cyborg out the hole, but he raised a hand in her direction, and a physical wave of force arrested her movement. He staggered against it, and as quickly as it happened, the pressure dissipated and his shoulders slumped. She recognized the touch of that spell. It pulled at a memory she wasn't aware she had. Reaching a hand forward, Rivaria searched that magnetic connection between them, analyzing it as she did.
"Why do you feel familiar?" "I'm you."
The cyborg's gaze rose to meet hers, and she stepped back. The whites of his eyes were now pools of black, the irises just a swirl of color in the darkness. A single line of inky goo ran down his cheek, and Rivaria gasped.
"Or rather, the bit of you that was thrown away."
He glowered at her.
"Forsaken and left behind to fend for myself."
Every word was enunciated with venom as Vel took a step forward.
"I am Alpha."
The gasp that escaped her lips turned into a soft exhale as her mouth pulled up into a smile.
"My beautiful revenant."
Rivaria reached out with her hand, ready to caress that cheek, but the magnetic repulsion kept her away.
"My missing shade."
Reuniting with it would make her whole. The power, the possibilities. It was almost as tantalizing as a portal to the past.
Wait, what?
Shifting his midnight gaze from the goddess, Alpha looked down upon a figure on the floor, the source of the squealing noise. His expression darkened.
You.
He recognized him as the man who had led him on a chase throughout the multiverse, ultimately leading to his own demise.
You ruined everything!
Eric barely had time to blink before his brother had crossed the room. He was snapped up in that iron grip, and as he gazed upon those blackened eyes, he realized this was no longer his sibling. And in the next breath, he found himself hurtling through the room and out of the opening in the wall.
No!
Rivaria lunged to catch the scientist, but her fingers only raked across his forearm. Soaring out into the open expanse of the night, Eric felt gravity begin its cruel task of hauling him towards the ground before he even fully registered what just happened. He spun wildly in the air, screaming as he flailed to catch hold of something, anything. He clawed at the wind, irrationally hoping it would somehow slow him down. He tried to breathe, but his lungs had forgotten how. His analytic brain counting the seconds until he reached terminal velocity instead. The entire planet rushed up towards him, the glowing city leaving burning after images in his retinas and casting long shadows against the illuminated point of impact. As he zoomed towards his demise, he was thankful he couldn't see clearly without his glasses. But even still, he could make out small buildings, trees, an abandoned wheelbarrow, and a man. He screamed, flailing his arms once more as he tried to warn them. The figure reached up, and a shimmering red crack split the air above him. It widened and opened its maw, swallowing Eric up just before he was to impact the ground. Eric's entire body trembled, still convinced that he was moments from death. The interior of the portal was so bright that even with his hands clenched over his eyes, it seared into his brain. He peered through the cracks in his fingers to see an endless series of explosions flying past him so fast that they became a continuous blur. He was alive, and traveling through a vortex at a speed so great that if he failed to slow his ascent, he would shoot out of the exit like a bullet fired from a gun. Eric reached out, digging his fingers into the glowing walls. His digits burned on a molecular level, searing his flesh and bone from the inside out. Despite the pain, it was working. He could feel his speed reducing, but it wasn't enough. He spotted the exit rushing up towards him. With a pop, he was launched, not down, but straight up into a hazy, overcast sky. The freezing wind stole the breath from his lungs as he was given a brief view of his surroundings with the momentary weightlessness before gravity hauled him down once more. Blurred outlines of a jagged gray horizon were buried beneath blankets of snow. He didn't need to be a mathematician to know that impacting solid ground from this height would be fatal. But the ground beneath Eric was pure white. A new layer of panic began to set in. Not the mindless fear of impending death, but the leapfrogging through all the different scenarios in which he might survive by some fluke or clever action. Fresh snowfall had a water content of approximately 5%. If he hit that, it would be more painful than landing in an airbag, but he could possibly survive, depending on how thick it was. But if it was hardpack, it would contain 10 times that amount of water and would be the equivalent of slamming into a brick wall. His mind rushed to come up with some way to improve his chances, but in the end came back with nothing. Well, there was no way of knowing, and he clenched his eyes shut, bracing for death. Instead of the painful impact of solid ground, Eric was slapped in the face by the topmost branch of a snow-covered pine tree, invisible in the sea of white. And then another, and another, each one painfully arresting his fall by bludgeoning his damaged body until at long last he crashed into the unforgiving planet. His teeth cracked together so hard he felt at least one of his remaining molars shatter. But he was alive. Eric looked up through 3 feet of soft snow, his body having left the perfect impression in it, and stared up at a gray sky between the many, many broken boughs of the tree. As he lay there, his lungs slowly remembering how to work, the hurt began to settle into his body. Not just the physical, but the emotional pain as well. He had failed, and billions were still dead. Wilfred had lied to him, setting him up for failure, and now he was... Where was he? Eric wiggled his fingers and toes, and a bitter relief washed over him as he felt them respond. He slowly and painfully pulled himself into a sitting position. Everything hurt so bad, he wasn't sure if he could tell if something was broken. Or perhaps it was just the cold starting to numb his limbs. As he looked around, all he saw was a blanket of glittering, blinding white snow. Behind him sat a rough mountain range, the peaks of which disappeared into lingering, lazy clouds. With the aid of the unkind tree, Eric pulled himself to his feet. He wheezed, feeling a small gurgle in his lungs as he steadied himself. After a moment, he stumbled out from under the branches. There was a glimmer of light, green and pale, that bathed everything in the eerie wash of dawn. It had been night only moments before, so if he was on the same planet, and that was a big if, he had traveled a great distance. As his eyes squinted against the horizon, he could only see the quickly vanishing specks of sun on the churning surface of the ocean. The waves brought in the salty, bitter, frozen air of the sea. A storm was coming, but there was not a building, tent, or even the curl of campfire smoke in sight. Eric's ragged breathing began to quicken. The rule of 3s sprung to mind. 3 minutes without air, 3 hours without heat, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. That's how long one could expect to survive. He wrapped his thin overshirt tighter around his body. It was the 3 hours part that had him concerned. After all that, he was going to freeze.
Wraith, we need to figure out how to get out of here.
He turned to watch that not-so-distant storm roll in off the sea, blocking out the sun with its thick, gray clouds and deluge of large flakes of snow. 3 hours might be optimistic.
I know you're still angry, but if I die, I don't know what will happen to you.
After a moment of silence, Eric spun to address his shadow directly.
Look, I'm sorry I didn't listen to you. Please don't stay mad at me in this situation.
He looked around, terror sparking to life.
I'm sorry. I'll do whatever penance you want once we're out of this, but please, can you help me?
Still, there was no response. He frowned. As snow began to pelt his face, Eric realized he had precious minutes before hypothermia began to set in. He closed his eyes. For the first time since their altercation in Avis, he felt around for the tether, the tie that connected him to his shadow bug.
Wraith?
Where his little friend used to sit, that tiny nook in his shade, there was nothing. only a hollow emptiness where something had once been. The chill that tore through him and caused his teeth to chatter had nothing to do with the drop in temperature. He was truly and utterly alone.
Buddy?
Stepping out from the spinning teal vortex, Piper clutched her fingers tight around the red garment in her hands as she experienced a wave of nausea. She couldn't be entirely certain that it was solely the fault of the portal as she held back a small burp.
Oh, whoops.
She whirled around on her brother, who had just stepped out behind her.
What do you mean, whoops?
The rest of their ever-growing party popped into view as the gateway snapped shut behind them.
Atticus scratched at his chin. Well, I was trying to get us back to that village we met Prince Herron at.
Piper glanced around. She and the others had stepped out onto a dusty and worn dirt path carved halfway up a stony hill. It was lined with mossy aspen trees, their white bark painted yellow by the faint light of the golden bubble in the distance that surrounded Avis.
We barely traveled 5 miles out of the city.
Atticus pulled his hat from his head and offered his sister a grimace.
Yeah, I think I misunderstood something in the instructions. Again.
Ignoring the surfacing memory of nearly becoming fertilizer for a giant plant, she turned away as he rifled through the chicken-scratched parchment to look for the others. The bear had taken no time to plod away from them all, clearly upset. Piper watched him amble up the road a bit before slumping in the dirt, his exhaled breath pluming dust into the air. The tiny merc patted the prints on his leg before he followed the monstrous beast, sitting down beside him. He leaned his head against the animal's massive arm as his shoulders heaved in silence. Piper wanted to join them, her own heart heavy with grief and worry, but she shoved it down. Someone had to keep all these mopey Marys on target. She blinked away the beginning of tears and forced herself to focus on something else. The light from the golden city below was bright enough to dimly illuminate their surroundings, but it couldn't touch the tower that sat on the other side of the river. She squinted through the darkness at where she felt it might be. Just as Piper had thought she spotted the building, Atticus moved to her side, holding up the scribbled notes for the device and opening his mouth to ask a question. But he was cut off when the ground rumbled beneath their feet. She flung out a hand to steady them both as the earth shook. There was a cascade of dirt and loose rock from the hillside behind them, and Herron braced himself against one of the white-barked trees, pulling the queen in close. She had stopped crying a while ago, but her eyes were puffy, and her cheeks were stained with tears. Still, Pyra couldn't help the shuddering exhale as she held on to the prince firmly. In all the chaos, all the heartbreak and pain, it was good to know she had one solid foundation of support. She squeezed his fingers to let him know wordlessly that she would be all right. She felt him relax, and, catching sight of a hint of a smile on his face, her cheeks flushed with warmth. After scanning for the source of the rumble, Pyra couldn't tell where it originated from. She turned towards the boy.
Young Atticus, is it? You are the academic, I presume. Is this tremor the result of the blue lightning we saw before departing?
I doubt it. The storm was likely a stabilization of the multiverse collapse.
Atticus pointed towards the city, shouting over the roar.
The rumbling is probably from whatever that is.
The four of them focused where the boy indicated. A phosphorescent purple glow was spreading in the darkness, outlining the tower as it poured down its sides. Herron took several cautious steps towards the edge of the road, pulling his fingers from Pyra's grasp. He swallowed hard as his gaze landed on the magic seeping from the windows and doors on the exterior of the castle, falling into the thick fog that floated along the ground like a foul miasma. It moved with purpose, filling the spaces between the remaining unshielded homes on that side of the river before dipping into the water and moving along with the current. They watched as the shattered remnants of the toppled city began to lift out of the churning water, floating upwards as if a giant hand were hoisting them back into place. The pieces couldn't connect with their other half that still stood, protected behind the glittering dome. So, they simply hovered in the air, encircled by magic. The rumbling ceased as the last concrete island broke free of the river's hold, leaving the night unnaturally silent. No creature or insect dared to make a sound. In horror, they stared on as bodies began to crawl out of the water. From this distance, they were merely specks in the glowing mist, but it wasn't difficult to make out their preternatural movements as they shambled towards the tower. Pyra took in a shuddering breath.
Ravaria is making more undead.
In the suffocating silence, she heard a tiny, hitched squeak, and she looked over to see the young boy's sister fighting back her body-trembling sobs. She moved to put a hand on the girl's shoulder, understanding what the presence of that purple mist meant.
I'm sure Vel.
Whirling around to glare up at the woman who shared her face, Piper hardened her own and shook her head violently.
Don't.
She sucked in a deep breath, burying her emotions.
We need to move. I'm not hanging around to find out if those zombies like brains.
But, Piper... Atticus's face fell as he nervously spun his hat.
What if something's happened to Vel?
She had been too focused on the Queen, and her brother's words caught her off guard, cutting into her. Piper put on a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and she turned to face him.
He made us a promise.
She looked down at the coat in her hands, trying to convince herself as much as her brother. She unfolded the garment and shoved her arms into the sleeves and flipped down the lapels.
And has he ever broken a promise before?
Atticus looked down at his hat, not at all convinced.
No, I suppose not. Exactly. So, it's a long walk to Oxhand, and I want to be there when he gets back.
She raised a finger to point in the direction she was sure the little town was, but the sleeves of Vel's coat were so long they covered her hands. Well, the whole thing was simply too big for her, and she knew she looked like a fool walking around in it. It didn't stop her, though. She shoved the ends of the sleeves up over her elbows and began searching through the pockets for a cord or a length of rope to cinch the coat tight around her, when her fingers bumped against something small. Piper pulled it out to reveal a delicate rectangle of gold glinting in the dim light. She had seen this dangling from Vel's left ear ever since she had met him. He had even berated her until he was hoarse for attempting to swipe it once as a joke. He might not come back for the coat, but he would come back for this. She clutched it tight. He would come back for her. The rustle of hooves and the churning of carriage wheels echoed up the path in their direction. Varen tapped the children and the lichen on the shoulder, ushering them off towards the safety of the bear. He tried to do the same for Pyra, but that warning in her amber eyes made him back down, and he allowed her to move up beside him. He placed his hand on the hilt of his sword, not expecting trouble, but ready for it. The orange glow of lantern light bobbed into view. Pulled along by a large, muscular onyx steed was a recognizable vehicle from his kingdom. Adorned with gold filigree, a red carriage came to stop just before their battered party, followed by several more that each halted in turn. Varen attempted to hail the driver, but the stoic woman didn't acknowledge his presence. Instead, she rapped against the side of the vehicle, signaling to whoever was inside that they had reached their destination. He frowned as the door flung open and an elegant cane preceded a familiar set of white flowing robes. Carrying his own lantern, Lucian hobbled the remaining distance of the path and stopped before the familiar face of his youngest half-brother. He leaned against his cane, holding the lamp higher, and took in the bloody state of his sibling with a bored sigh.
And here I thought perhaps we were on the wrong backwater path.
His voice was lazy and disinterested, as if he couldn't give two worries for what was happening around them.
I guess it's good to see you, brother.
He gave the prince the slightest of bows, but didn't offer the same courtesy to the woman at his side, the words falling from his mouth with a sneer.
Queen Pyra?
Given all that Herron had endured, from the regret of his naivety and his 50 years in exile to the recent loss of Elias, the only emotion he could rally at that moment, standing before his half-brother, was to pull back a fist and smash it into the elf's nose. He felt it connect with much more force than he had meant, and blood showered the ground as Lucian stumbled back, dropping his lantern and crashing into the side of the carriage.
Herron!
Pyra reached forward to waylay him from striking the man again, but the prince didn't resist her. He remained calm and showed no sign to follow through with anything other than to glare at his eldest sibling. He wanted nothing more than to vent all the anguish and pain that had built up in him over the years, but that would get them nothing but more problems. Herron folded his arms across his chest and huffed in the other man's direction. Lucian spat out a mouthful of blood into the dirt, glancing up without malice.
I suppose I deserved that.
Why are you here?
Pyra steadied her own feelings, tamping down the rage that the mere sight of the elf brought to her, the decades of torment bubbling up in her memories. Dabbing at his bleeding nose, Lucian touched the tender skin carefully, inspecting it for a break. He didn't meet either of the royal's gaze as he reached into his robes and produced a roll of parchment, wrapped in regal red ribbons.
The Wild Queen has summoned you. I am but a messenger.
Herron accepted the scroll, his fingers trembling as he broke the wax seal and unfurled the pages. In the light of the lantern, he read, "By proclamation of Her Highness, Auxilia Folkgrave, Prince Herron, Queen Pyra, and company are requested to appear before the High Court in the Amber Hollows within the next fortnight." His eyes skimmed over the usual vomited formalities and standard inane political prattle to see that the Wild Queen had indeed stamped and signed the pages. To forge such a thing meant death, so it was likely genuine. He nodded to Pyra, handing her the scroll to read. In his life, he had only ever seen one exchange between their two kingdoms, and that was when Elias asked for help in fending off the Brotherhood. Not even his father had dared to step foot within the enshrined wilds.
Wait just a minute.
Piper strode forward into the light.
How did you know where to find us? We weren't even supposed to be here.
Lucian blinked. He glanced between the queen and the new girl. He chalked the odd double vision up to the pain in his face and stuffed his handkerchief back into his robes with a roll of his eyes.
Mother has her ways. I stopped questioning them long ago.
He gestured to the waiting line of carriages with a sweep of his hand.
Well, I don't have all night to wait for your response. Actually, I do, but I don't care enough to do so. Let's go.
There was a long moment of stagnant hesitation before Herron relented with a sigh and nodded to the others. Their party moved with the speed of a somber funeral procession. Piper and Atticus kept glancing towards the tower before climbing into the second carriage with Winter. The third carriage had been made specifically for Barry, as it was little more than a covered wagon, and the tiny merc jumped in after the animal. The Wild Queen didn't just know where to find them, but who all would be present as well. Varen took the lantern from Pyra as she climbed in behind Lucian into the first carriage. He paused before following. In the flickering light, he looked down at his shadow. 2 sad yellow eyes blinked up at him, and Varen heard the tiniest and heaviest sigh in the back of his mind. What words could he offer the little shadow creature? He placed a fist against his chest and made a circling motion, signing, "I'm sorry." A soft, humming lullaby drifted through the darkness of his unconsciousness, and Atlas felt a smile form on his lips. A cooling touch was placed against his forehead, and he couldn't help but be comforted by it. His curiosity was too strong. He needed to see whichever beauty that voice and caress belonged to. It gave him the strength to open his eye. Instead of the heavenly face he was expecting, Atlas's eye focused on the starch-white ceiling of some brick building. He could hear the low rumble of speech, the clack of heels on tile, and then a door opening and shutting. As the fog cleared from his mind, his surroundings came into sharper focus. The smell of disinfectant and the sound of people coughing in the distance told him he was in a hospital. There were even curtain partitions sectioning off the room. "Ah, you're awake!" Atlas groaned as he attempted to sit up. His body felt like a burlap sack filled with rocks, and it didn't help that his wrists were shackled to the iron headboard of his cot. His good eye swiveled over to the owner of that voice to see a thin and frail man with a bowl haircut and sallow skin staring back at him. He couldn't make out much of his face, as it was hidden beneath a heavily bandaged nose, but it surely wasn't the vision he had imagined. He tried to sit up again.
"Oh, excuse me, but..."
Before he could shuffle into a sitting position, someone else shoved him back down and leaned over him. A head of tightly coiled blonde ringlets appeared, and it made his foot twitch in fear and his guts churn. The good news was that meant he didn't have a spinal injury. The bad news was that he recognized that heart-shaped face, splattered with freckles, and those vibrant green eyes. He would have been smitten if it was someone worth being smitten over. Instead, he'd nearly soiled himself. "Miss Ruby would like to remind you that your wounds are quite severe, and that it is best for you to remain still." Atlas shot a glare over at the mousy man.
"Oh, really? Then maybe, if my wounds are that bad, you should tell her to get off."
The woman was practically vibrating as she laid against him, her fingers drawing idle designs on his chest. Her battle doll armor was just as frilly and sharp as ever, but the look on her face was new. It was difficult to pin down. Mentally deranged came to mind. He tried to wriggle out from beneath her, but she just shook her head, her blonde hair bouncing on her shoulders. Ruby placed her hands on either side of Atlas's face and locked eyes with him. She had let him slip away once before, but not this time. He would make the greatest gift for the scholar. Smiling with that thought, she pinched the meat of his cheeks and jumped from the bed. She snapped at the speaker, pointing to the Brotherhood soldiers, then back at the Arcanist. Charles bowed. "Understood." Ruby skipped from the room, like a child off to play in the village square, holding up the ends of her skirt. The mousy man cleared his throat and addressed the 2 guards near the foot of the bed. "Miss Ruby wants you to keep an eye on our guest here until she returns with the scholar." He exchanged a pointed look with either robed figure, assuring he had their attention. "I am going to grab our new friend here something to eat. Do not let anyone other than myself, Miss Ruby, or the scholar enter this room. I don't care if the Prime Minister himself shows up." He patted the Arcanist on his chest. "If he tries to leave, shoot him in the leg." The two guards snapped into a salute as the speaker left the room and remained stock still until his footsteps faded from the hall. Atlas watched them shift their metal fire wands into a more relaxed stance and moved to the side of his bed, facing the door. Out of the frying pan and into the fire, he thought. Well, actually, it was more like out of the exploding building and into the clutches of a wacky lunatic who treated him like a jilted ex-lover. Atlas sighed as he looked up at the iron cuffs shackling him to the bed. Great. So magic is out of the question. Not that that was his only trick. "Oi, lads, I need to use the loo." "Be quiet." One guard spun, his black robes whirling out behind him. "I'd hate to have to explain to the scholar how you broke your jaw falling out of the bed." Atlas let out a huff between pursed lips. His only other plan was to flirt his way out, and he wasn't sure if his charms would work on these militaristic guards. He didn't have any other options, so he shrugged to himself and shifted in his bed, laying half on his side. "Well, if you won't let me out, would you mind scratching an itch for me?" He propped up one of his legs, letting the blanket and his gown fall away seductively. The first guard didn't acknowledge him, but the second flushed a deep shade of red. Ah, there it was, Atlas thought with a smile. He sent the man a wink, which is hard to do with only one eye, but not impossible. It had the desired effect, and the soldier glanced away nervously. He was just about to pull out all the stops when the shadow of a massive barrel-chested body flowed across the divider sheet between his bed and the next. The curtain flung open, and two hands shot out, reaching for each of the guards in turn. Atlas winced at the sound of skulls cracking against one another. The two men slumped into a pile on the floor, unconscious. He swiveled his eye towards the shadowy figure blocking out the light. That dented copper robot had come to rescue him once more. He let out a whoop of laughter as he lifted his shackled hands to gesture at the chains. "Oh, good timing, buddy! Now hurry up and get me out of here before they wake up!" The robot moved forward, responding with a garbled mess of words. "Stop!" Charles was back, his tiny voice barely registering over the sound of the clattering bowls as he dropped the tray of oatmeal. He pointed a finger up at the machine, forcing it to halt. "Back away from the prisoner, or I will have your hardware." Despite having the size advantage and a body made of metal, the robot put its tiny coiled hands in the air and froze in place. Atlas let his head fall back to the pillow with a groan. He had let that brief moment of tantalizing freedom lift his hopes, only to see them so thoroughly squashed. He really didn't want to know what the Jewel of the Brotherhood had planned for him, but now he was stuck having to find out. Something whizzed over his head, followed by a loud clang and the slumping of a body to the floor. Atlas blinked in surprise and looked over to see Charles was unconscious, blood pooling out from his heavily bandaged nose. "What the?" Atlas's words were cut short as a dark-skinned man stepped around the copper robot to collect the metal bedpan he had presumably thrown. He nudged the unconscious priest with a bare foot and laughed. "Well, he's out cold. What a wafer that drongo is. I'll bet a good blast of wind would knock him silly." Atlas shuffled in his bed, trying once again to sit up. The newcomer was wearing a medical gown and sported several bandaged wounds, layered thick with gauze on his face and arms. But sprouting from that mop of disheveled blonde hair was a pair of horns. A male dryad, all the way out here?
Oh, thanks for the help?
Even though there was a warm smile on the man's face, Atlas couldn't be sure of his intentions. He rattled his chains once more, hoping to regain the ability to use magic, just in case. The row-bit snapped the manacles, and he was free to sit up properly.
"Oh, think nothing of it, mate."
The dryad offered him a smile.
"You'll have to excuse my bedpan humour."
He lifted the item he had used to knock Charles unconscious.
"But we really should focus on getting you out of here."
Atlas let out a pained groan at the pun, but the man only stared back at him, wearing that open-mouthed grin that said he knew his joke was horrible, but enjoyed the misery on his face. The dryad set down the bedpan and began to shove articles of clothing into a knapsack he pulled from the other side of the dividing curtains.
"You're going to be up a gum tree if we stay here any longer. You and I both have appointments with this scholar fella, and I really don't like the sounds of it."
Atlas's temporary surprise was replaced by panic as he remembered Ruby would return any moment. He made to jump out of the bed, but instead his legs failed to work and he face-planted the spotless tile floor of the ward. He shifted, looking down to see one of his legs was wrapped in hard cloth from hip to toe.
"What the hell is this?"
The dryad, pulling on a pair of pants beneath his gown, belted out a light-hearted laugh.
"Ah, look at that! You're not going anywhere on your own with that busted-up leg."
He threw off the gown and replaced it with an ochre-colored sweater.
"But no worries, I have a plan."
Atlas scratched at his head as he was hauled upright and gently placed back on the ground in a rough standing position.
Wait.
He glanced over at the dark-skinned man with rising suspicion.
Why are you helping me? Who are you?
When the dryad turned to look at him, the light from the window reflected off a rectangle of gold that dangled from his right ear.
"Ah!"
He chuckled to himself.
"How rude of me. To answer your first question, I want out of this hospital as bad as you do. I hate 'em. Too many bad memories. I also don't fancy sticking around to find out who this scholar person is."
He stuck out a hand, offering it up to the Arcanist, and a smile lit up his amber eyes.
"And as for your second question, I'm Lucas. It's nice to meet ya."
That concludes the audiobook of Portals and Portents by Lesley Herron. If you enjoyed this and would like to listen to her other books in the series, you can find links in the description to where you can listen to them all, or you can visit talltaletv.com/series. Lesley and I would like to thank you so much for all the support we've received during this process. And we understand how difficult it can be to wait so long for a book to come out. We try to write as fast as we can, but there's only so much we can do. As for the next book, our current plan is to be releasing the first chapter within about 3 to 5 weeks. We have a decent idea of what we're doing, but there's some kinks left to work out. So until then, that's it for Of Portals and Portents.